Oh my God, this changes everything.
Imagine waking up one morning next to the person you love more than anyone on earth. You have been married to them for over a year. You have built a home together. You have learned their coffee order, their laugh, the way they breathe when they are deeply asleep. You believe with everything you have that you know this person completely. And then, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a single document lands on your desk and turns every single thing you thought you knew about your marriage, your career, and your own life into a question mark. This is not a story about betrayal in the traditional sense. It is not a story of affairs or lies born from cruelty. It is something far more complicated than that. It is a story about a man who decided that the only way to be truly loved was to be invisible. And it is a story about the woman who loved him completely without ever knowing who he really was. In the next 2 hours, we are going to take you through every chapter of this story, from the very beginning to the extraordinary ending that nobody who was there will ever forget. Stay with us because what is coming will stay with you long after this video ends. They said she married down. They said she threw her career away for a man who pushed a mop for a living. They said she was a fool. But what they didn't know, what nobody in that building knew, was that every single day, while she was filing reports on the 14th floor, the man she loved was secretly signing off on the entire company from his private office on the 22nd. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the story we are about to tell you is one we have spent months researching, and it is the kind of story that reminds you that the most extraordinary lives are almost never the ones that look extraordinary from the outside. Her name was Margaret Calloway. And if you had walked through the offices of Vantage Solutions Group on any given morning in the spring of 2018 and asked someone to point out the most dependable, most respected, most quietly formidable person in the building, almost everyone would have pointed you in the same direction, toward a woman in her early 40s, moving through the open plan floor with the kind of unhurried purpose that only comes from someone who has never once needed to prove herself through noise. Margaret Calloway did not demand attention. She had long since understood that real authority is not announced, it is felt. And in that building, on that floor, everyone felt Margaret Calloway before she even entered a room. She had grown up in Peoria, Illinois, the daughter of a factory foreman named Gerald and a school librarian named Ruth. Gerald worked the early shift at a Caterpillar plant on the south side of town and came home every evening smelling of machine oil and pride. Ruth spent her days surrounded by books and her evenings making sure her daughter understood that the distance between where you start and where you are going is crossed one deliberate step at a time. They were not wealthy people, but they were the kind of people who understood that character is the only currency that never loses its value, and they raised Margaret accordingly. She watched her father navigate a workplace that did not always treat him fairly and hold his head high anyway. She watched her mother extend kindness to every child who walked through the library doors, regardless of where they came from or how many books they had already torn. These were not lessons Margaret was taught. They were things she absorbed through the walls of a modest house in a quiet city, the way children absorb everything that matters, through witness. She earned a full scholarship to the University of Illinois, the first in her family to go to college. She graduated top of her class in business administration and spent the years that followed doing what driven women with no safety net always do. She outworked everyone around her. She did not do this to prove a point. She did it because she had seen what happened when you stopped paying attention, when you let the ground shift beneath you without noticing, and she had made a private decision somewhere in her early 20s that she would always be ready, always be sharp, and always know exactly where she stood. By her mid-30s, she had built a reputation as one of the most thorough and ethical compliance officers in the Midwest financial services sector, a field that does not often celebrate the people who do it well, because the whole point of their work is that nothing goes wrong. But before Margaret Calloway arrived at Vantage Solutions, she lived through something that left a mark on her that no professional achievement would ever fully erase. She had been married once before, briefly, in her early 30s, to a man named Todd, who was charming in the way that some men are charming before they get what they want. They had met at a conference in Indianapolis. He had seemed impressed by her ambition in those early months. But as her career advanced, and his did not, something curdled in him. He had wanted a successful wife in theory. In practice, he wanted someone whose success would always remain slightly less than his, just far enough back to keep his pride intact. Margaret's career did not cooperate with that arrangement. The marriage lasted 3 years, and when it ended with lawyers and with silences and with the particular grief of realizing that the person you trusted most had been quietly resentful of you the entire time. She had not walked away bitter, exactly, but she had walked away careful. The kind of careful that takes years to arrive at and becomes such a natural part of how you move through the world that you stop noticing it is there. She had learned the hard way that trust is not something you extend until you have a reason not to. It is something you earn before you receive it. She arrived at Vantage Solutions Group in the fall of 2016 as a newly hired senior compliance officer, and she threw herself into the work with the singular focus of a woman who had learned that her career was the one relationship in her life she could count on absolutely. Advantage Solutions was a mid-sized financial advisory and asset management firm based in Chicago, founded in 1987 by a man named Robert Harrison, who had built it from a two-person operation in a rented office on the north side of the city into a company managing close to $340 million in client assets. By the time Margaret joined, the firm occupied 3 floors of a downtown high-rise, employed just over 200 people, and had a reputation in the industry for being old-fashioned in the best possible sense. The kind of firm where the clients actually knew their advisors' names and the advisors actually knew their clients' situations. Margaret respected that culture immediately. She recognized in it something that was becoming increasingly rare in the financial world. A place that still cared about doing things right as much as it cared about doing things profitably. She settled in. She kept her head down. She did her job with the kind of precision that people around her began to rely on the way they rely on gravity, without thinking about it, simply trusting it to hold. And then on a Wednesday evening in late October of 2017, everything changed. Not all at once. Not in the dramatic, unmistakable way that change announces itself in films. It changed the way it almost always changes in real life. Quietly, without ceremony, beginning with something so small that neither person involved could have recognized it as a beginning at all. It began with a cup of coffee left on a desk. Margaret had been working late, alone on the 14th floor, long after everyone else had gone home. She was finishing a compliance review that had already taken 3 days longer than it should have. The kind of work that requires total silence and total focus and yields absolutely zero glory, which is precisely why Margaret was good at it. She had not noticed the man in the gray uniform at first. The building maintenance staff worked in the background of the office the way furniture works in the background of a room. Present, functional, invisible. His name tag said James. He was mopping the corridor just outside her glass-walled office with the methodical, unhurried pace of someone who understood that good work done quietly is still good work. At some point, Margaret looked up, noticed his paper coffee cup sitting on top of his cleaning cart, and realized she hadn't had water in 4 hours. She got up, walked to the break room at the end of the hall, made 2 cups of coffee from the machine, walked back, and handed one through the door to James without making a big deal of it. He looked surprised, not dramatically surprised, but surprised in the way a person is surprised when they have grown so accustomed to being looked through that being looked at catches them off guard. He thanked her. She nodded. She went back to her desk. And that, as far as she was concerned, was that. But James came back the next evening, and the evening after that, and on the 4th evening, he left a cup of coffee on her desk while she was in the copy room down the hall, with a small note that said, "Saw you working late again." Jay. She read it standing in the middle of her office alone in the fluorescent quiet of a building after hours. And she felt something shift slightly inside her chest. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way a door shifts when someone on the other side leans against it. She did not know what to do with that feeling, so she did what she always did with things she did not know what to do with. She filed it away and went back to work. But she did not throw the note away. Over the weeks that followed, something grew between them in that building, after hours that neither of them named and neither of them pursued, and neither of them could entirely ignore. Brief conversations in hallways, small gestures of acknowledgement, the particular comfort of another person's presence in a space that is otherwise empty. Margaret told herself it was nothing. She was a professional. She had a reputation to maintain. She had learned her lessons. And yet she found herself, on nights when there was no particular reason to stay late, finding a reason to stay late. She was not ready to examine why. The first real conversation happened on a Wednesday evening in November. Margaret was at her desk, still working at 8:30 at night, and James was mopping the corridor outside her office when a particularly dense section of the compliance report she was reviewing caused her to make a sound of pure, wordless frustration and lean back in her chair and stare at the ceiling. James from the hallway said, without stopping what he was doing, "Whatever it is, it can probably wait until morning." She looked at him. He looked back at her, still mopping, with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was not a smile. She said it could not wait until morning. He said everything people say cannot wait until morning, almost always can. She told him he obviously did not work in compliance. He said that was true, and for some reason, perhaps because it was late and she was tired and there was no one else in the building, she laughed. And then he laughed. And then they were both standing in the doorway of her office talking, and then they were sitting on the floor of the corridor with their backs against the wall and their legs stretched out in front of them and paper cups of break room coffee in their hands, talking the way people talk when they have decided, without saying so, that the rules of formal life do not apply at this particular moment in this particular place. They talked for 40 minutes about nothing important, about everything that mattered. She told him about Peoria and about the library and about her father's hands. He told her about growing up being told to want things he didn't want and about the relief of doing work that was what it was, no more, no less, no performance required. He listened the way very few people in Margaret's life had ever listened, with his full attention, without waiting for his turn to speak. She noticed that. She noticed it the way you notice when a room you have been living in for years is suddenly very quiet. She drove home that night thinking about the conversation, which she had not expected to do. She told herself it was because she was tired, and the conversation had been pleasant, and she had not had a genuinely uncomplicated interaction with another human being in longer than she wanted to admit. She told herself all of this was perfectly reasonable. She did not tell herself that she had already decided she was going to stay late again the next Wednesday. But she had. His name was James Whitmore. That was what his name tag said. That was what he told her. That was what she called him for the next 14 months, which is remarkable when you consider what was actually true. Because James Whitmore was a name, but it was not the whole name. The whole name was James Whitmore Harrison. And James Whitmore Harrison was not, in any legal or financial or organizational sense, the head of building services at Vantage Solutions Group. James Whitmore Harrison was the sole majority owner, the silent executive signatory, and the acting chief executive officer of Vantage Solutions Group. He owned the entire building they were sitting in the corridor of. He owned every floor, including the 22nd, where his private office looked out over the city he had spent 4 years quietly, methodically, invisibly running. And every single person in that building, including the woman now sitting on the floor beside him with a paper coffee cup in her hand, had absolutely no idea. To understand why James Harrison did what he did, you have to understand who Robert Harrison was. Robert Harrison built Vantage Solutions from nothing. He was the son of a steelworker from Gary, Indiana, who had grown up watching his father's industry collapse around him and decided with fierce determination that he would build something of his own that no one could take away. He was brilliant, driven, charismatic, and by all accounts extraordinary as a businessman. He was also, by the accounts of the people who knew him best, deeply permanently lonely. The company consumed him, not metaphorically. It consumed him the way a fire consumes a house, thoroughly, leaving only the structure. He missed school plays and wedding anniversaries and funerals of people he had loved because there was always something at the firm that needed his attention more urgently. His marriage to a quiet, patient woman named Eleanor survived for 22 years on hope and silence before Eleanor finally and very quietly left. His son James watched all of this from childhood, through adolescence, through early adulthood, and understood with the clarity of a child who has spent years observing a parent from a careful distance exactly what the company had cost his father. Etram, he loved his father. He admired what Robert had built, and he wanted absolutely no part of running it. James had built his own life deliberately far from the boardrooms and power lunches and quarterly earnings calls that had defined his father's world. He had studied environmental science. He had worked for a nonprofit in Montana. He had spent 2 years hiking trails and learning the names of plants and living in a way that felt true to who he actually was, rather than who his last name suggested he should be. He was, by his own description in later interviews, happy. Not in a performed, curated way. Actually happy. He had found himself in the absence of the things his father had spent a lifetime accumulating. And then the call came. Robert Harrison had his first heart attack at 68. He survived it. He did not survive the second one, which came 8 months later on a Tuesday morning in March, very quietly, in the corner office on the 22nd floor. He was found by the building maintenance staff, the same staff that James would later join as a cover. The irony of that particular detail is one that James has mentioned in interviews more than once, always with an expression that is difficult to read. He inherited everything: the company, the client relationships, the staff of 212 people, the obligations, the ongoing contracts, and a firm that, in the 18 months preceding Robert's death, had begun to show the early signs of a cultural rot that Robert had either not noticed or had chosen not to address. There were issues with how lower-level staff were being treated by certain middle managers. However, there were reporting irregularities that were small enough individually to ignore, but concerning enough collectively to take seriously. There were whispers, in the way there are always whispers in organizations where power is distributed unevenly, of people being told to stay quiet about things they should not have been told to stay quiet about. James looked at all of this from outside the company, during the weeks after his father's death when he was meeting with attorneys and accountants and trying to understand what exactly he had inherited. And he made a decision that was either the most calculated or the most instinctive thing he had ever done, depending on who you ask and what day you ask them. He decided he needed to see the company for what it actually was before he could decide what to do with it. And he could not see the company for what it actually was by announcing himself as the new owner and walking in the front door, because the moment he did that, everyone in that building would perform for him. Everyone would become, in some sense, an actor in a version of Vantage Solutions that existed for his benefit rather than in spite of his presence. He had watched his father be surrounded by performance for 30 years and never once fully penetrate it. He was not going to make the same mistake, so he hired himself. As a janitor, he created a simple, clean identity, James Whitmore, and he applied for a position on the building maintenance staff of his own company. And he started work at 5 in the morning on a Monday in April, 3 months after his father's death. And he began to learn the company from the ground up in the most literal sense those words can mean. What he found in those first months was not what he had expected, which is itself significant because he had expected to find problems. He had braced himself for the worst. What he found instead was a company of mostly good people working under a structure that had, in certain pockets and at certain levels, allowed the wrong kind of authority to calcify. He found managers who treated the maintenance staff with casual contempt, not maliciously, just with the easy indifference of people who had never been asked to think of those below them on the organizational chart as fully dimensional human beings. He found employees who were afraid to bring legitimate concerns to their supervisors because the culture had never made it safe to do so. He found a break room on the service corridor that the executive staff on the upper floors did not know existed, where the maintenance and cafeteria workers ate their lunches and talked about their lives in the frank, unguarded way that people talk when they are certain no one with any power is listening. James sat in that break room and he listened. He listened for months, and he made changes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily and consistently, and always through the established management channels. Drafted as policy recommendations from a consulting firm, he had engaged for exactly this purpose, so that no one inside the building could trace the changes back to any individual and begin asking questions he was not ready to answer. The break room on the service corridor was renovated. And the anonymous employee concern reporting system was upgraded and actually responded to. Two managers whose behavior toward lower-level staff had been flagged multiple times were quietly counseled and, when counseling proved insufficient, quietly removed. He did all of this in a suit on the 22nd floor in the evenings, after the building had emptied out, after he had put away the gray uniform and taken the service elevator up and sat in his father's chair and worked in the silence of a company that did not know it was being watched. And then in the mornings, before almost anyone arrived, he put the uniform back on and went back downstairs. For 4 years, James Harrison lived in both worlds simultaneously, and for 4 years, no one knew. And then he met Margaret Calloway. We're sitting on the floor of the 14th floor corridor with a paper coffee cup in her hand, and everything that had been working so precisely began to work differently. He noticed her before she spoke to him. He had been observing people in that building for almost a year before she arrived, and he was by that point very good at reading the difference between performance and authenticity in the way people carried themselves at work. Most people, when they think someone in authority might be watching, perform a version of themselves that is slightly better, slightly more composed, slightly more appropriate than the real version. Margaret Calloway worked exactly the same way, whether anyone was watching or not. He noticed that immediately. He noticed the way she stayed late not for visibility, but because the work required it. He noticed the way she greeted the maintenance staff by name, the way she had clearly made a point of learning those names, which almost nobody on her floor had done. He noticed all of this the way you notice things when you have spent years training yourself to see past the performance to what is actually happening underneath. And what he saw in Margaret Calloway, underneath the composure and the focus and the careful professional distance, was someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had simply decided to carry it alone. The coffee notes started as impulse. He brought one to her desk one evening and told himself it was just a kind gesture, the sort of thing decent people did for each other without it meaning anything beyond what it was. He told himself this for about 3 weeks before he had to admit, only very quietly and only to himself, that it was not simply a kind gesture. That he thought about her in the evenings when he was in the corner office on the 22nd floor, in the silence of the building after hours. That he had begun to find reasons to be on the 14th floor on the nights he knew she stayed late. He had not intended for any of this to happen. He had not intended for a lot of things that were happening. Their relationship grew the way the best relationships grow, incrementally, honestly, one conversation at a time. They talked about books and about cities they had lived in, and about the specific, complicated grief of losing a parent, and the specific, complicated weight of trying to figure out who you were supposed to be when the person who had the clearest idea of that was no longer around to tell you. Margaret talked about her father's dignity and her mother's kindness, and the particular loneliness of being extremely good at your job in a field where excellence was expected and rarely acknowledged. James talked about Montana and about silence and about the strange relief of doing work that could be finished and then put down, work that did not follow you home and sit in the corner of every room. He never talked about the 22nd floor. He never talked about the suits in the locked closet or the board meetings or the client portfolios or the $340 million that he was responsible for and that nobody in that corridor knew was his responsibility. Every word he said to Margaret in those late evening conversations was true. He was not lying to her about himself. He was leaving out the part of himself that he had decided long ago was the part that changed everything, the part that made people see a role rather than a person. He was leaving out the part that had cost his father everything. He was leaving out the part he had spent 4 years running from. He told himself this was a careful distinction. He told himself it was not the same as lying. He would revisit that claim later, in a kitchen, on a Saturday morning, in front of a table full of documents, and he would not be able to sustain it. They dated in secret for 8 months. James insisted on this, and Margaret, who valued privacy and had no interest in being the subject of office conversation, was grateful for it. They went to restaurants in neighborhoods far from downtown. They drove on weekends to small towns along the Illinois River and walked along the water and talked. He met her sister, Dana, who liked him immediately and told Margaret afterward that she had never seen her look so relaxed around a man, which Margaret filed under the category of true things she was not ready to think about too carefully. He met her two oldest friends, Carla and Bev, over dinner on a Friday night, and he held his own in a conversation that covered everything from the best Chicago deep dish to the moral philosophy of late capitalism, and both women told Margaret independently on the drive home that James Whitmore was the realest person she had ever brought to meet them. Margaret agreed with this. She agreed with it completely and without reservation, which is itself one of the most quietly devastating details in this entire story. James took her to a park near her apartment on a Sunday morning in April, 2 years to the month after his father had died, and proposed with a ring he had chosen carefully. A simple, understated ring, a half-carat solitaire on a thin gold band. The kind of ring a man buys when he wants you to know that what he values about you has nothing to do with what he can afford. Margaret would say later that she had spent most of her adult life suspecting that grand gestures were a form of theater, and that the truest expressions of love were almost always the quiet ones. James's proposal was one of the quietest and one of the truest things she had ever experienced. He sat across from her on that park bench in the April morning, and he said, "Efroy, I want to spend the rest of my life with the person you are, and I hope you want to spend it with the person I am." Those were his exact words. Margaret would remember them precisely because she would return to them later, over and over, when the full meaning of what he had said finally revealed itself. He was not simply expressing love. He was asking a question that he already knew contained a secret. He was asking her to love him, and he was not yet able to tell her all of what she was being asked to love. He knew this. He asked anyway. She said yes. They married 6 weeks later in a ceremony so small it could have passed for a dinner party, 20 guests in the private room of a restaurant on the north side of Chicago, with Dana as the maid of honor and James's only close friend. A man named Aaron who had known him since his Montana days as the best man. No corporate colleagues on either side. No announcement in any publication. No social media posts. Margaret attributed this to their shared preference for privacy. James attributed it to necessity. The CEO of Vantage Solutions had just quietly married one of his company's senior compliance officers, and nobody on earth knew it. That sentence alone contains the architecture of everything that was about to happen. The first year of marriage was good, genuinely, warmly, quietly good. They bought a house in a suburb northwest of the city, a 4-bedroom colonial that was larger than they needed, but had a backyard with an enormous oak tree that Margaret had fallen in love with immediately, and that James had said he liked too. And later, when reporters asked him about the house, he would say that the oak tree was the first truly extravagant thing he had allowed himself in years, and that it had felt like a beginning. He drove the same 10-year-old truck he had driven since before his father's death. He cooked breakfast on Sunday mornings with a particular seriousness about the proper temperature for scrambled eggs. He remembered everything Margaret told him, not in the performative way of someone trying to appear attentive, but in the way of a person who is genuinely interested in the specific texture of another person's experience. He was present in a way that Margaret had not expected and had not known how much she needed until she had it. She was happy, not performed happy, actually happy. The word her sister Dana would later use in interviews was settled, and she would say it with a kind of wonder in her voice, as if it were the most unexpected thing she had ever seen. But Margaret Calloway was a compliance officer. She had spent 15 years building a career on the premise that what you see on the surface and what is actually occurring below it are two different conversations, and that the gap between them is always where the truth lives. She did not bring this professional lens home deliberately, but she also could not take it off the way you take off a coat when you come inside. It was simply the way she saw the world, the way she had always seen the world, the way her father's experience in her first marriage and 15 years of financial oversight had combined to make her see the world. And slowly, without quite meaning to, because she began to notice things about James Whitmore that did not add up. Not large things. Not the kind of things you raise at a kitchen table and make a moment of. Small things. He always paid in cash. Always. She had thought this charming at first, even slightly anachronistic in the way she found a lot of things about James charming. But it had continued without exception for the 14 months of their marriage. Every grocery run, every dinner out, every hardware store visit, cash. He had a second phone, a detail she had noticed on their third date, and had mentioned once, and he had dismissed easily as a work phone, which was not a suspicious answer on its face, but which she had never quite stopped being aware of. He took calls on it by stepping outside, always every time, which she attributed to habit until she counted. And the number of times he stepped outside to take a call began to seem less like habit and more like system. There was a door in their home office that was always locked. She had never thought to test it until she did, one evening when James was outside raking the yard, and it was locked firmly, with a key she had never been given and had never thought to ask for. And then there was the dry cleaning receipt she found in a jacket pocket in the fall of their first year of marriage, a receipt from a tailoring house whose name she did not recognize, for 3 custom suits, the total on the receipt just over $12,000. She stood in their laundry room holding that receipt for a very long time. She was not panicking. Margaret Calloway had never been a person who panicked, but something in her, the part that had spent 15 years learning to read the space between what was visible and what was true, had gone very, very quiet and very, very alert. She put the receipt back in the jacket pocket. She put the jacket in the dry cleaning pile. She did not say anything. She had learned from her first marriage and from her career that the most dangerous thing you can do when you suspect something is act before you understand what you are looking at. She needed to understand what she was looking at. She might have continued in this state of careful, private watchfulness indefinitely, or at least until the accumulation of small inconsistencies grew heavy enough to force a conversation, if it had not been for Derek. Derek Marsh was 24 years old, a first-year analyst in Margaret's compliance department. I recently arrived from a graduate program at Northwestern, and constitutionally incapable of letting an interesting problem alone. He had been hired in January of Margaret's second year at the company and had established himself immediately as the kind of employee who was either going to be extraordinarily valuable or quietly insufferable. Possibly both. He asked questions that other people had learned not to ask. He pulled at threads that other people had learned to leave alone. He was, in the most irritating and necessary sense, a natural compliance officer. Margaret recognized him immediately because she had been exactly like him at 24 and had been told by more than one superior that she asked too many questions, which she now understood to mean that she asked exactly the right number of questions. Derek had been working on a routine internal directory update in the early weeks of February, the kind of administrative task that gets assigned to junior analysts precisely because nobody expects it to turn up anything interesting. He was cross-referencing employee records with public company registrations as part of a broader regulatory compliance review that Margaret had assigned to the department in preparation for a quarterly audit. It was tedious work. It was necessary work. And buried inside it, like a single loose thread in an otherwise seamless piece of fabric, was something that should not have been there. Vantage Solutions' ownership structure, which was publicly registered and theoretically a matter of accessible record, and turned out on close examination to be considerably more layered than anyone in the building had reason to expect. 3 holding companies, 2 entities registered in Delaware that listed no individual directors, 1 offshore vehicle routed through the Cayman Islands, all of it pointing, when you peeled back each layer in sequence, to a single individual whose name Derek had to read 3 times before he was certain he was reading it correctly. Derek walked to Margaret's office at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon with a single printed document in his hand. He put it on her desk without preamble. He said, "I think you are going to want to look at this." And then he walked back to his desk without further comment, because whatever he suspected he was handing her, he understood that it was hers to carry, not his. Aunt Margaret picked up the document. She read it. She read it again. The name at the top of the beneficial ownership chain was one she recognized. She had been saying it every morning for 14 months. She had said it the previous evening when she asked him whether he wanted chicken or pasta for dinner. She had said it in a courthouse on a Saturday in June, in front of 20 people and a judge, and she had meant it with everything she had. The name was James Whitmore Harrison, and James Whitmore Harrison, according to the document currently in her hands, was the sole beneficial owner and acting chief executive of Vantage Solutions Group, the company where Margaret Calloway Whitmore was currently employed as a senior compliance officer, the company where James Whitmore had been pushing a mop for the duration of their entire relationship. The company whose lobby floors he had buffed at 5 in the morning on every morning, she had kissed him goodbye and told him to have a good day at work. He had been having a very different day at work than she had been told. What she did next tells you everything you need to know about who Margaret Calloway was and why the people in her life would later say, almost unanimously, that the most astonishing thing about this story was not what James had done, but what she did in response to it. She did not go home and confront him. She did not call Dana. She did not cry at her desk or make a scene or any of the things that a person in a state of shock might reasonably do. She thanked Derek for bringing it to her, went back to her desk, and did her job for the rest of the afternoon with the same composed, thorough focus she brought to every other afternoon. And then she drove home and made pasta for dinner and sat across from her husband at the kitchen table while he talked about a loose fitting he had repaired on the third floor. And she listened, and she asked follow-up questions, and she smiled at the appropriate moments. And she felt something inside her that she would later describe as the specific cold of realizing that the ground beneath you is not what you thought it was, not the hot panic of alarm, but the deep, still chill of understanding. She called her attorney the next morning. Her name was Patricia Chen, a woman who had built one of the most respected corporate and family law practices in Chicago over 20 years of meticulous, unsparing work. Margaret had retained Patricia 2 years earlier for a routine matter and had never had occasion to call her since. She called now and said she needed to come in as soon as possible and that the matter was complicated in a way she preferred not to discuss on the phone. Patricia had been practicing law long enough to recognize that particular combination of composure and urgency, and she cleared her afternoon. They met at 2 o'clock. Margaret laid 11 days of private research on Patricia's desk, organized with the same methodical precision she brought to every compliance review she had ever conducted, and she walked her attorney through it. Patricia listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished speaking, Patricia was quiet for a full 30 seconds. Then she said, "Margaret, do you understand what you are sitting on?" The legal situation, Patricia explained over the next hour, was layered in a way that she could not immediately locate precedent for. Margaret was a senior compliance officer at a firm that, she now knew, was wholly owned by her husband. Her entire employment relationship, her access to confidential client information, her fiduciary responsibilities, her regulatory reporting obligations, all of it existed within a structure in which the controlling party was a person with whom she had a personal relationship that had never been disclosed to the board, to the regulators, or to anyone within the firm. The question of whether Margaret had done anything wrong was answerable clearly and immediately. She had not. She had not known. The question of what James had done, what obligations he had violated, and what the potential regulatory and legal consequences were for the firm, and for him specifically, that question was considerably less simple. Patricia needed time to research. She told Margaret to go home, to say nothing to James, to maintain complete normalcy for 72 hours while she did the work. Margaret drove home. She made dinner. She sat at the table. She maintained complete normalcy. She would later say that those 3 days were the strangest of her life, not because of the anger, which she had not yet fully felt, but because of the grief. The grief of realizing that something she had believed was true was not true, and of not yet knowing whether what replaced it was something she wanted. She chose Saturday morning, no distractions. She had been methodical about every aspect of what was about to happen because she was Margaret Calloway, and methodical was how she operated. But she had also been honest with herself about the fact that this was not a compliance review. This was her marriage. She set the documents on the kitchen table before James came downstairs, organized, flagged, every significant piece of evidence arranged in the order in which it told the story most clearly. She heard him on the stairs. She heard him in the kitchen, the sound of his hand on the coffee maker. And then silence. When she looked up, he had seen the table. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen in his weekend clothes, and he was looking at the documents with an expression that she had prepared herself for many possible versions of. Denial, deflection, was the kind of controlled executive calm that manages difficult revelations by immediately managing the narrative around them. She had not prepared herself for what she actually saw. What she saw on her husband's face, in the first moment he understood that she knew, was something that looked like relief. Not happiness, not shame, relief. The specific, exhausted relief of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has finally, in the most painful possible way, been relieved of it. He sat down at the kitchen table. He put both hands flat on the surface, the way people do when they need something solid under them. He looked at the documents for a long moment, and then he looked at her and said, "I'm sorry. I should have told you long before this. I was afraid if I told you, I'd lose you." And Margaret looked at this man she had married, this man she had sat on the floor of a corridor with at 8:30 at night and talked to like she had known him forever. This man who had proposed to her on a park bench with a half-carat solitaire and said the truest, most complicated, most ultimately impossible thing anyone had ever said to her. And she said, "James, you may have lost me anyway." What followed was 4 hours of the most important conversation either of them had ever had. James told her everything. Not the legal and corporate architecture. She already had that. He told her the human truth. He told her about his father and about the company, and about the slow, comprehensive way the company had consumed everything in Robert Harrison's life until there was nothing left of the man except the institution. He told her about Montana and about what it had felt like to live without the weight of expectation and legacy and the particular burden of being a Harrison in a company that had Harrison in its DNA. He told her about inheriting the firm and about the decision he had made, which he no longer needed to defend but still needed to explain, to go inside his own company before announcing himself so that he could see it clearly, the way you cannot see something clearly when it is performing for you. He told her about the break room on the service corridor and about the managers he had eventually removed and about the policy changes and about all of the things he had been able to do because he had seen them firsthand, on the ground, in the uniform, before anyone could prepare a version of reality for his benefit. And then he told her about the corridor on the 14th floor and about a cup of coffee and about the particular way she had handed it to him without ceremony, without condescension, with the simple, ordinary grace of a person who had been raised to treat every other person as a full human being. And he told her that he had known, somewhere in those first weeks of conversation, that he was in a situation that had become impossible, that he had found something real and true with someone who deserved the whole truth, and that he had not been able to bring himself to give it to her because he had been so certain that the truth would take her away. He had drafted the disclosure conversation 14 times on his laptop on the 22nd floor. He had come close twice, and once on the drive to a small town along the river on a Sunday afternoon in late spring, and once on the morning he had picked up the ring from the jeweler and held it in his hand in the parking lot and sat there for 20 minutes trying to find the words. Both times fear had won, not a small fear. The same fear that lives in every person who has found something that matters and cannot bear the thought of losing it. The fear that the person you love most might look at you differently once they see everything. He said this to Margaret quietly and without excuses, and with the kind of directness that she would later recognize as the most honest he had ever been with her, which is one of the most painful elements of the story, the fact that his most honest moment came in the wake of his greatest deception. Margaret listened to all of it, and she did not interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "James, I need you to understand something. I am not angry that you are who you are. I am angry that you decided, before you even knew me, that I couldn't handle it." James looked at her when she said this, and something in his expression opened in a way she had not seen before, the way a room opens when you finally find the right window. He did not have a response. He simply looked at her, and she let him look. And the morning light came through the kitchen windows and fell across the documents on the table between them, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Margaret returned to work on Monday. She had made a decision over the weekend, and it was not the decision about her marriage, which was still unresolved and would remain so for weeks. The decision she had made was the one that was not actually a decision at all, because for Margaret there had never been any other option. She was a compliance officer. She had identified a material conflict of interest. She had one professional and legal and ethical path forward, and she had always known it from the moment Derek had placed that document on her desk. She disclosed. She drafted a formal memorandum to the board of directors of Vantage Solutions Group outlining the conflict of interest she had identified. her relationship to the controlling party, the circumstances under which she had acquired the information, and the fact that she had sought legal counsel immediately upon discovery. She filed it with the board secretary at 9:15 on Monday morning. She walked back to her desk. She continued working. When her colleagues noticed nothing different about her, she gave them nothing different to notice. The response from the board was not immediate, but it was swift. Within 48 hours of receiving Margaret's memo, the board had convened an emergency session by conference call, had retained outside counsel to advise on the regulatory implications, and had reached out to James through channels that were, by all accounts, considerably less composed than Margaret's original disclosure. By Thursday morning, the story had reached the Chicago Tribune through sources that James's attorney would later describe as impossible to trace, but not difficult to infer. A story on the business desk, a short piece initially, one under a headline that read, Vantage Solutions, CEO, identified after 4 years operating anonymously within own firm. By Friday, it had been picked up by the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Bloomberg, and every financial services trade publication in the country. By the weekend, it was on the national news. The quiet company on the upper floors of a Chicago high-rise was suddenly one of the most discussed stories in American business. And the two people at the center of it were trying to have a marriage while the rest of the world tried to figure out what to make of what they had done. James did not hire a crisis communications firm. He did not release a statement through a spokesperson. He did not do any of the things that the people around him strongly advised him to do in the 72 hours after the story broke. What he did instead was call a press conference for the following Monday in the lobby of Vantage Solutions, and he did it on his own terms, with his own words, and without a suit. He wore the gray janitor's uniform. He stood at a lectern in the lobby of the building he owned, surrounded by every tier of his company, maintenance workers in their uniforms, and executive staff in theirs, and everyone in between. And he looked into the cameras of every major news outlet in the city, and he said, I owe my employees, my board, and my wife an honest explanation, so I am going to give you one. And then he talked for 22 minutes without notes. He told the full story of his father and of the inheritance and of the decision he had made and why he had made it. He told the story of what he had found inside his own company, of the culture problems he had discovered and corrected, of the break room on the service corridor, of the managers he had removed, of the changes that had been made because he had seen them from the ground rather than from an altitude that made them invisible. He said that a CEO who has never mopped a floor cannot understand the people who mop floors every day. He said it not as a slogan, but as a conclusion he had arrived at through 4 years of evidence. And then he talked about Margaret. He said, the woman I married is the best person I have ever known. She found the truth I was hiding, and instead of protecting herself with it, she disclosed it because it was the right thing to do. I have spent 5 years pretending to be someone simpler than I am. She has spent her entire career being exactly who she is. She is the one who should be running this company, not me. And then he announced that he was stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. And then he announced that he was personally nominating Margaret Calloway Whitmore as a candidate for the position, on the grounds that she was the most qualified person he knew, and because she had demonstrated in the most difficult circumstances imaginable, the one quality that every organization requires in its leadership, and that no title, no credential, and no resume can fully substitute for. Integrity under pressure. The silence in the lobby after he finished was the kind of silence that holds for a moment before it becomes something else. A maintenance worker near the back of the room began to applaud, then another. By the time the sound reached the front, it had become something full and genuine that the cameras captured and that would be replayed in news segments for months. Margaret was not in the lobby. She was at home, watching the live stream on her laptop at the kitchen table, in the house with the oak tree in the backyard, and her expression was something that the people who knew her described afterward as unreadable, in the specific way that Margaret Calloway's expressions were always unreadable when she was feeling the most. The business world's response to what James had done was divided sharply and immediately along predictable lines. Half of the financial press called it the most authentic act of leadership they had seen from a corporate executive in years. A genuine attempt to build accountability into the structure of an organization from the most foundational level upward. The other half called it theater, a story constructed after the fact to reframe what was at its core a serious governance failure and a prolonged deception of the people who worked for him and the woman he had married. Both of these readings were, in their way, correct. James himself has never disputed either of them. What he has said in the interviews he has given sparingly and reluctantly in the years since is that he was not trying to be a symbol, and that the fact that his actions became a symbol of something is one of the most unexpected and uncomfortable outcomes of a series of decisions that were made, every single one of them out of something much less noble than principle. They were made out of fear, the fear of becoming his father, the fear of being seen only as the institution, and ultimately, and most painfully, the fear of losing the one person who had ever seen him as simply a person. Margaret did not accept the nomination the way James had framed it. She submitted a formal request to the board the day after the press conference that her name be considered through the same blind evaluation process as any other candidate, with no preferential treatment, no fast tracking, and no weight attached to her relationship to the departing CEO beyond what was legally required to be disclosed. The board was, by multiple accounts, both impressed and slightly bewildered by this. Her candidacy was considered. She was not ultimately selected. The board chose an external candidate in a decision that was announced 6 weeks later and that Margaret acknowledged publicly with a single sentence to a reporter who caught her outside the building, which was, "I trust the board made the decision that was right for the company." She said nothing else. She went back inside and finished her work. 3 weeks after the press conference, Margaret moved into a friend's apartment, not with anger and not with ultimatums. She told James she needed time and space to understand the difference between the man she had fallen in love with and the man she actually lived with, and whether or not those two men were, at their foundation, the same person. James did not argue. He did not pursue. He moved back into the secondary apartment, the one he had maintained during his years undercover. The one that Margaret had once found flagged on an insurance document and never asked about. And he waited. He had spent 4 years perfecting the patience that comes from watching a company from the inside without being able to announce himself. He applied that same patience now to the hardest weight of his life. Margaret spent those weeks the way she spent every difficult period in her life. She worked. She ran the lakefront path early in the mornings before anyone else was out. She had long phone calls with Dana, who was angry on her sister's behalf and loving in all the ways that matter and careful not to tell Margaret what to think. She turned the question of her marriage over and over in her mind with the same methodical precision she brought to every other complex problem, which was both her greatest strength and the thing that, in matters of the heart, could sometimes become a way of avoiding the conclusion you had already reached. She returned again and again to the same moment. The park bench in April, James's hands, the modest ring, and the words, "I want to spend the rest of my life with the person you are, and I hope you want to spend it with the person I am." She had understood those words as love. She understood them now as something more complicated than love. She understood them as a man standing at the edge of the truth he had not yet found the courage to tell in asking her, without being able to explain why, to love him on trust. She understood that it had been a cowardly thing and an honest thing at the same time, and that holding both of those truths simultaneously was exactly the kind of complexity that her life had always required her to be large enough to hold. She drove to his apartment on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks and 4 days after she had left. She rang the bell. He opened the door. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I have a question." He said he would answer it. She said, "If I had known who you were from the beginning, if you had sat down across from me at that first coffee and told me you were the CEO of the company, would we be standing here right now?" James was quiet. Not evasively quiet, genuinely quiet, in the way of someone actually searching for the honest answer rather than the easy one. And then he said, "No, because you would have kept me at a professional distance. You would never have seen me. And I needed someone to see me without all of that, even if it was the wrong way to make it happen." Margaret looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "That is the most honest thing you have ever told me." And she stepped inside. Margaret submitted her resignation from Vantage Solutions the following month. She cited in her resignation letter the impossibility of continuing to fulfill the duties of a compliance officer with integrity in a corporate environment where her personal situation had become structurally inseparable from the governance questions of the institution, and where her continued presence created ongoing uncertainty for both the company and herself that served neither party well. It was by any measure an extraordinarily gracious letter from a woman who had every right to be considerably less gracious. She had 3 job offers within 2 weeks of her resignation becoming known in the industry, which tells you everything that needs to be said about the professional reputation she had built over 15 years of doing things right, when doing things right was inconvenient. James Whitmore Harrison remains a majority shareholder in Vantage Solutions Group. He serves on the board as a non-executive director. He attends meetings by phone when possible. He and Margaret sold the house with the oak tree and moved to a smaller city in Wisconsin, where Margaret leads the compliance function at a regional financial institution, and James does consulting work for nonprofit organizations focused on labor practices and workplace culture. By most accounts, they have built, in the aftermath of everything, in a life that is quieter and more private and more genuinely theirs than either of them had before the Saturday morning when the documents were on the kitchen table and everything changed. James has said in interviews that the years undercover, for all of their complexity and all of their cost, taught him the single most important professional lesson of his life, that you cannot lead people you do not understand, and you cannot understand people you are not willing to become vulnerable enough to actually see. He has also said, with the wry self-awareness of a man who has had a great deal of time to think about his own choices, that there were significantly better ways to learn that lesson than the one he chose. Margaret, when asked by a journalist what she would tell her younger self knowing everything that was coming, said simply, "Pay attention to the quiet ones." But before we close, let us take a moment to step back from Margaret and James specifically, because their names and their particular circumstances are not ultimately what this story is about. Their names are the vehicle. What this story is about is something older and more universal and more uncomfortable than any single marriage or any single corporate deception. And it is something that the men watching this, particularly the men who have spent decades inside institutions, inside hierarchies, inside the particular machinery of American professional life, will recognize immediately, even if they have never said it out loud to another living person. This story is about the cost of the mask, not the gray janitor's uniform specifically, the other mask, the one that most men in this country put on sometime in their 20s and spend the rest of their lives either perfecting or quietly suffocating inside of. The mask that says, "I am what I produce, I am what I earn. I am the title on the door and the car in the driveway and the number at the bottom of the quarterly report. I am the performance of competence and control, and the moment I stop performing it, I become nothing." That mask, the one James Harrison spent 4 years running from, the one his father never took off. Robert Harrison built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars and died alone in his office on a Tuesday morning, found by the maintenance staff. His son inherited everything except the one thing that would have made the inheritance bearable, in which was a father who had been present long enough to become a person rather than a symbol. This is not a story unique to the Harrisons. It is one of the most common tragedies in American life, so common that it barely registers as tragedy anymore. It is simply the accepted cost of ambition. The man who worked too hard, the husband who was always at the office, the father who provided everything except his actual presence. These are not villains in the stories we tell about them. They are, more often than not, understood, admired even, because the culture that produced them told them, every single day, that what they were doing was the right thing. That sacrifice in service of provision was the definition of a good man. That the corner office was the proof of worth, and the worth was what made them lovable. Robert Harrison believed all of this. He was not unusual in believing it. He was, in fact, perfectly representative of a generation of American men who were handed a definition of manhood that had almost no room in it for the things that actually make a life. James watched his father live inside that definition and chose, as a young man, to reject it entirely. He went to Montana. He worked with his hands. He found a version of himself that did not require an institution to give it shape, or an audience to give it meaning. And he was genuinely happy in that version of his life, in the way that people are happy when they have found the thing that is actually true about themselves rather than the thing that is expected of them. This is important to understand because it changes how you read everything that came after. James Harrison did not go undercover in his own company because he was playing a power game or conducting a social experiment or building a narrative he could sell later. He did it because he was terrified of becoming the thing that had taken his father from him before his father ever really arrived. Terrified of the way power isolates, the way it builds a wall between you and every honest interaction you might otherwise have, the way it turns the people around you into performers and turns you, in response, into an audience rather than a participant in your own life. He had a front row seat to that transformation for 30 years. He chose the gray uniform because the gray uniform was, paradoxically, the most honest thing he had available to him. It let him be a person before it let him be a position. And here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated in a way that does not resolve cleanly, because James's reasoning was not wrong. The things he discovered by working inside his own company from the ground level up were real. The culture problems were real. The changes he made were meaningful, and they were made possible precisely because he had seen them from inside rather than from altitude. The philosophy behind what he did was not without substance. There are business school professors who have written about cases like this one in exactly these terms, as a radical but ultimately instructive example of embedded leadership. A CEO who chose proximity over authority and obtained a quality of organizational intelligence that conventional leadership structures almost never produce. If James Harrison had been a consultant hired to do what he actually did as the owner, the business world would have called it innovative. The complication is that none of the intellectual legitimacy of his reasoning changes what it meant in practice for the people who were closest to him, for the employees of Vantage Solutions, who deserved to know who they were actually working for the board members who had fiduciary obligations that were being structurally undermined by an arrangement they had not consented to, and most of all for Margaret, who had built her entire understanding of her marriage on a foundation that was, in one fundamental and inescapable way, incomplete. The reasoning was not wrong. The execution was not honest. And James Harrison has lived in the gap between those two truths every day since the Saturday morning when Margaret set the documents on the kitchen table. What Margaret did in response to everything is the part of this story that deserves its own examination, because it is easy to let it get overshadowed by the drama of James's revelation and the spectacle of the press conference and the noise of the business world trying to categorize what had happened. But what Margaret did, quietly and without theater, is the moral center of this story. She discovered that her husband had withheld something fundamental from her. She discovered that her entire professional situation had been compromised by a conflict of interest she had not created and could not have known about. She was, by any reasonable measure, a person who had been wronged in multiple ways simultaneously, personally, and professionally, in the place where she had invested the most of herself in both dimensions. And what she did was go back to her desk, do her job, call her attorney, disclose the conflict, file the memorandum, follow the protocol. Not because protocol is easy in those circumstances, because protocol for Margaret Calloway was not a bureaucratic reflex. It was an expression of who she was. She had built her entire professional life on the premise that the rules exist for reasons, that the oversight structures exist for reasons, and that the person who decides to look the other way, because looking straight ahead is personally costly, is exactly the kind of person who makes the oversight structures necessary in the first place. Because she was not going to become that person because it was her husband. She was going to be herself, which was the only version of herself she had ever known how to be, which was exactly, if the full irony is to be honored here, the quality that had made James Harrison fall in love with her in the first place. There is a line from James's press conference that has been quoted more than any other in the coverage of this story, and it is the line where he says that Margaret is the one who should be running the company, not him. A great deal of commentary has been devoted to parsing whether that statement was sincere or strategic, whether it was a genuine acknowledgement of his wife's qualities, or a calculated narrative move designed to reframe the story in a more sympathetic direction. This debate is, in some ways, beside the point. Or because the more interesting question is not whether James meant it. The more interesting question is whether it was true. And the answer, by every account of the people who worked with Margaret Calloway over 15 years, is that it was simply accurate. She was the most qualified person he knew. She had demonstrated in real time and under genuine pressure exactly the quality that the position required. The board chose differently for reasons that are their own. Margaret accepted their decision and moved on. Because accepting the decisions of legitimate processes with grace, even when those decisions are not the ones you would have made yourself, is a form of integrity that is considerably rarer than the noisier forms. What this story ultimately asks of us is not a verdict on James Harrison, though it is tempting to try to deliver one. It is easy to look at what he did and reach for a clean conclusion. He was wrong. He should have told her sooner. He should have disclosed to the board. He should have found another way. All of these statements are correct. They do not constitute the whole truth of who James Harrison is, or of what he was trying to protect, or of what it costs a person to have spent their formative years watching love get slowly starved out of someone by the institution that was supposed to give their life meaning. Context does not excuse the choices he made, but context is the only thing that makes the choices legible as choices rather than simply as failures. And if we are going to be honest about why this story resonates so deeply with so many people, it is because most of us understand, on some level, what James was afraid of. Most of us have kept something back from someone we loved because we were afraid that the whole truth of who we were would be too much. Most of us have found, at some point, the place where honesty and self-preservation run directly into each other and have had to decide which one to serve. Most of us have not always chosen honesty, and most of us are living, to one degree or another, with the weight of that. The men watching this, and we know who you are because you have stayed until this point in the video, which means this story found something in you that was worth staying for. The men of a certain age who built their lives inside the same cultural framework that built Robert Harrison, and that James Harrison spent his whole adult life trying to escape. The men who went to work every morning and provided and performed and delivered and came home and did it again the next day and told themselves that this was what it meant to be a good man, a reliable man, a man of substance and worth. The men who maybe, somewhere along the way, lost track of the difference between what they were doing and who they actually were. This story is not a rebuke of that life. The provision was real. The sacrifice was real. The love behind it, even when it was expressed almost entirely through absence, was real. But James Harrison's story asks a question that his father's story could not ask, because his father never found the margin to step outside the institution long enough to hear it. The question is this: underneath all of it, underneath the title and the performance and the obligation and the identity that the work gave you, is there a person in there who is known? Not known for what he does, not known for what he provides or what he earns or what his name is on the organizational chart. Known, seen. The way Margaret saw James in that corridor before she knew there was anything else to see. That is the question this story puts on the table and does not answer for you, because it cannot answer it for you. Only you can answer it. And the only way to answer it is to be willing, as James eventually was willing, to let someone actually see. We want to sit with that for just one moment before we close, sorely because this is the part of the story that does not get talked about in the business press coverage, and that did not make it into the Tribune headline, and that is not what the professors write about in their case studies. This is the part that belongs to the space between two people on the floor of a corridor at 8:30 at night, with paper coffee cups in their hands, talking like they had known each other forever. That moment was real. Everything that surrounded it was complicated, and in some ways wrong, and in other ways understandable, and in all ways human. But that moment was real. The conversation was real. The way James listened was real. The way Margaret laughed was real. The way neither one of them moved to leave was real. And the love that grew from that moment, through all of the deception and the disclosure and the legal complexity and the press conference and the separation, and the Thursday evening when she rang his doorbell and asked her question, that love was real too. It did not become unreal because the circumstances around it were not what she had been told. It did not become false because the story that contained it had been incomplete. Love is not a contract. It cannot be voided by a disclosure. It can be damaged by one. It can be tested by one. It can be forced to become something harder and more honest and more clear-eyed than it was when it was young and uncomplicated. But Margaret Calloway walked into that apartment on a Thursday evening, knowing the whole truth, every layer of it, and she stepped inside. That tells you everything this story has to say about what love actually is when it is the real kind. Now, before we close, here is what we want from you. We want you to be honest in the comments today, in the way that this video has asked you to be honest with yourself for the last 2 hours. If you were James, and you had found someone who saw you without the title and without the weight and without all of the things that the world had decided you were supposed to be, and you were terrified that the truth would take that away from you, what would you have done? Would you have found the courage to tell her? Or would you have held on the way James held on, convinced that what you were protecting was the love itself, right up until the morning it was no longer yours to protect alone? And if you were Margaret, knowing now what she knew on that Thursday evening when she drove to his apartment, knowing the full extent of what had been kept from her, knowing the cost it had already extracted from her career and her sense of her own life, knowing all of that, would you have rung that bell? Or would the wound have been too deep? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions this story actually asks. And we genuinely want to know your answers because the people who watch these videos are not passive observers. You carry these stories because something in them belongs to you. So tell us which part of this one is yours. Leave it in the comments. We will be there. And before we let you go, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. Wherever in this country or in this world you have found us tonight. And if you have not already, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what is coming next is something we have been working on for months, and it is the kind of story that will make this one feel like a warm-up. It is the story of a woman who walked away from a $4 billion inheritance on the day of her father's funeral, drove to a town that no one in her family had ever heard of, and spent the next 8 years quietly building something that ended up being worth twice what she left behind. It is a story about what happens when a person chooses the life that is true over the life that is expected and the price they pay for it. And the extraordinary thing that grows in the space where the expected life used to be. That video goes up next week. You do not want to miss it. Until then, we want to leave you with the last thing James Harrison said in the final interview he agreed to give, 2 years after the press conference, conducted over coffee at a small place near the apartment in Wisconsin, where he and Margaret had settled into the quieter version of their life. The reporter asked him, as a final question, what he would say to his father if he could. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I would tell him the company was worth less than he thought and cost more than he knew. And I would tell him that the man he was, when nobody was watching, was the man worth knowing. I wish he had let more people know him. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked out the window at the street, and then he said very quietly, almost to himself, I almost made the same mistake. I almost kept the wrong thing safe. He did not say anything else. The reporter did not ask another question. Some answers are complete exactly as they are. This has been the story of Margaret and James. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know.